What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you something a little bit different from my usual stuff with an update of sorts about, naturally, Steam's hardware announcements that they made a few days ago. A little bit behind the ball on this one, but that's mostly because I was waiting to cover it as it provided me a convenient opportunity to provide a sort of channel update on some things I've been kicking around in terms of like the Steam Deck, which we also got a small update on. Now, I would say, since we're a few days after the announcement, there's a fair chance you're already well aware of this. I've had people asking me about it already. And so if you're just curious about what this means for the channel, feel free to jump to the end. I should have it time-stamped appropriately. But in order to give potentially everybody the full story here, we're going to start at the beginning about what some of this hardware actually is, why it's important, stuff like that. And then I'll get to the part where it's, relevant to what the channel's doing towards the very end. So, last but not least, before we dive in, feel free to just listen. Honestly, I'm going to show some images of the new hardware here and there, but otherwise it's just going to be some generic gameplay in between. You certainly won't be missing much by just listening to this one. But otherwise, let's go ahead and dive in. So, on November 12th, Valve, and thus Steam, announced via both their own channels, obviously, but also via like embargoed press stuff, that they introduced the next generation of the Steam machine, the Steam frame, and the Steam controller. And we also got a small update about the Steam Deck alongside of all that. Now, the big thing is obviously the Steam machine, and curiously enough, while you may think this is completely new, I suppose, and that would be fair, as I don't know how widespread of knowledge this is, but that's actually not the first iteration of the Steam machine. There was a failed attempt at doing this about 10 years ago that was thought to be canned, however that turns out to not be true exactly. They continued working on it, things like the Steam OS, which resulted in the Steam Deck itself, which has finally gotten them to the place of the actual Steam machine. But what is that? To say it's a console would be, not necessarily far off, but not exactly true either. Basically, it's a small PC that plays the entirety of your Steam library, and in this case, they're targeting 4K 60 FPS on basically everything, with upscaling, mind you, and obviously probably not going to hit the max graphical options either. But the real story here is that, functionally speaking, it's a more powerful version of the Steam Deck that you can hook up to something that actually has a screen, mind you, to play basically your Steam library via its either 500 gigabyte or 2 terabyte options. It's also got some expandable storage via micro SD, which should work completely, but all in all, it should be roughly about 6 times better than a current Steam Deck, while also being ultra compact at that. It's about a 6-inch by 6-inch cube, from what I understand, and while it certainly won't be the most powerful thing on the market, I think if they have a relatively reasonable price here, it could serve as, honestly, a really good entry-level PC for people that functions much in the way a console does, and you can thank a lot of that purely on what they did with the Steam Deck. So one of the reasons the Steam Deck works the way it does is the Steam OS. That is an operating system specifically designed to play video games, whereas typically operating systems are not designed to just play video games. That means the Steam OS has a lot of optimizations and things that actually really help out in that front, and while it's not obviously a cure-all, with this bigger hardware than the Steam Deck has, it's of note for sure. I don't want to get into every little bit of the engineering here, but suffice to say, it's very compact, surprisingly powerful for how small it is. It's very energy efficient, and I think if they can nail the exact pricing, which is not something we know yet, but we do know it's coming in 2026, there's very clearly a market for this. And yet, that's not everything we have to talk about. We also got the announcement of the Steam controller, the other upgraded version of something they've done previously. This time around, the Steam controller is aiming to solve 2 separate problems. One, obviously, to give you a controller for the Steam machine we just talked about, but it's actually also intended to solve a problem for the Steam Deck as well, because basically what the Steam controller is the current Steam Deck's control layout just as a dedicated controller. The reason for this being that the Steam Deck is great control-wise when you're actually playing it and on the go, but, most people really like to put it in a docking station and hook it up to the TV, at which point they switch to a controller, and the honestly pretty impressive native controls of the Steam Deck suddenly don't matter because you're not using them. They wanted to provide people with a controller that worked exactly the same as the Steam Deck because of that, and also, as you would expect, is perfectly compatible with the Steam machine for the exact same reason. There's a couple of other new things to go along with it, but that's the core of it that you need to know. Now, the last thing they announced is of little interest to me personally, but it is the Steam Frame, which is like a VR streaming headset. It's completely wireless for the most part. You just plug in the wireless adapter and you're good to go. There should be like a more standalone option available with it as well. It's also going to be capable of like playing non-VR games with this headset as well. So all of that combined with what is mostly being described as a much more lightweight bit of hardware, some impressive specs, things like that. It looks interesting if you're into VR. Personally, it makes me violently motion sick. So it's not for me personally, but it looks cool if you're into that kind of thing. And then last but not least, while the press was at Valve's headquarters, they had the opportunity to ask, of course, about the Steam Deck, or more importantly, the Steam Deck 2, perhaps. So essentially the gist is that they know what they want the Steam Deck 2 to be. They are interested in making it, but they're kind of waiting until they can get it to a point where it's going to be a gigantic upgrade rather than a more incremental one, particularly in regards to the battery. If you play much with the Steam Deck at all, you'll more than likely know that honestly probably like the worst thing about it really is the battery life is not great. And while it's great for use, like around your house even, letting you get, your PC library away from the PC, unfortunately, when it comes to actually using it as its portable handheld form, the battery makes that less than ideal. And so they naturally want to improve upon that experience, especially now that they've got something like the Steam Machine, which is performing that sort of core function in your living room all on its own in a much more powerful form factor anyway. So far, so good. Now, with all of that out of the way, let's get back to me. How is this relevant to this channel? What am I actually bringing up all of this for? I'm obviously not a big hardware guy. Well, basically, as many of you know, I include a section of my reviews where I talk about the Steam Deck. This is a PC channel, first and foremost. I spend a lot of time on Steam, and if I can provide some people value there, then that is of note to me. But in particular, how it relates to this is that recently we saw the release of the ROG Ally X, or the ROG Ally, which will play things like your Steam library on that bit of hardware, and I was debating about whether or not to get it because the Steam Deck is getting a bit old. It turns 4 next year. And it is obviously having trouble keeping up with modern games, as it wasn't like the most ridiculously powerful bit of hardware when it launched. And it's due for an upgrade, simply put. So I had been debating about whether or not to pick up things like the ROG Ally X to provide people that service, and yet my concern there is that it doesn't exactly seem to be dealing with the amount of market penetration that stuff like Steam's hardware has. And personally, what I'm not trying to be is a hardware review channel. I'll leave that to the experts over at places like Digital Foundry. And so for me, at least, what I want to do is, again, try to give people as much value around, playing PC games on these different forms as much as I can. So the Steam Machine and both the Steam Deck 2, whenever that happens to actually drop, are of great interest to me personally. The Steam Machine, I think, makes a ton of sense for me because it would actually give me a way to move my, honestly at this point, ridiculous Steam library into different portions of the house and still be, playable, all that jazz. I could even make use of some of that family sharing, let my son more easily access some of the games on there, things like that. So even just outside the context of my own reviews, there are reasons for me that a Steam Machine would be very convenient because of how, again, kind of over the top my Steam library has become. So it would make a lot of sense to just buy that for myself and then, of course, report back to how it plays for people. And then ideally, I would love to wait for a Steam Deck 2 before I really moved much on the handheld hardware side of things. But I guess that's kind of where I wanted to solicit some of the audience's opinions because I know the Ally and the Ally X were exciting for some people in the sense that it's quite a bit stronger than the Steam Deck, could play all those games, get access to your Steam library, stuff like that. And so I could see the value of switching over to that, but I also really don't want to be trying to juggle like 2 different handhelds and how they're running on those in addition to the actual review part of my job, which already keeps me extremely busy. So In a perfect world, I guess I would just be happy to wait for the Steam Deck 2, but I would be curious to, again, just hear from the audience if you guys want to tell me how you feel about that. But my personal thinking, at least, is that it would probably make more sense to wait on a potential upgrade for the Steam Deck, but again, I'm curious to hear people's thoughts. As for today, though, I think that's pretty much going to wrap it up. Hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, by all means, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. Let me know how you feel about all this down in the comments below. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.